The crimson sky glowed ominous above Cedar Grove as 37 souls scrambled up the mountain path. Smoke billowed behind them, devouring pine and memory with equal hunger. Their faces, streaked with ash and terror, told a singular story. There was nowhere left to run. Harriet Blackwell, who had spent 62 years believing she knew everything worth knowing about Cedar Grove, clutched her husband's arm as they stumbled over exposed roots. "We're going to die up here," she gasped between labored breaths. "That crazy woman can't save us." The crazy woman they sought had a name: Grace Harrison. The same Grace Harrison who had abandoned her teaching position, her Victorian home on Maple Street, and every sensible expectation of how a 52-year-old widow should behave. The woman who had vanished into these mountains 2 years ago, becoming nothing more than whispered gossip over coffee at Harriet's general store. As they rounded the final bend in the trail, the fleeing townsfolk stopped in collective awe. Before them stood an ancient oak tree, impossibly massive, its trunk measuring at least 20 feet in diameter. What rendered them speechless wasn't the tree's size, but the exquisitely carved wooden door set into its base. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Intricate spiral patterns framed a threshold that could not exist. The door swung open. In the doorway stood Grace Harrison, silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, eyes clear and knowing. A golden Labrador, gray-muzzled but alert, stood faithfully at her side. "Come inside," she said simply. "Quickly now." The world was burning, and 37 people who had once mocked her now followed Grace Harrison into the heart of the impossible tree, where salvation waited within wood older than their collective histories. Sometimes the people who laugh at you the loudest are the ones who need you the most. Grace Harrison had not always lived inside a tree. 2 years earlier, she had been a respected art teacher at Cedar Grove High School, where she'd taught for 23 years. She had a daughter, Sophia, who had graduated college and moved to Boston to pursue a career in architecture. She had a Victorian home with blue shutters that needed repainting and a garden that bloomed with heirloom roses. She had a life that looked perfectly reasonable from the outside. What she didn't have was her husband. Thomas had left after 23 years of marriage, departing with devastating efficiency when he discovered she couldn't bear another child. "I still have time to start over," he had explained, as if their shared decades were merely a false start in his actual life. "I need someone who can give me a family." Grace had stood in their kitchen, watching him pack his vintage records, the ones they danced to on Sunday mornings, and realized she had spent half her life being someone she thought Thomas wanted her to be. The mountains had always called to her. As a girl, she'd explored the forests, collecting leaves and sketching the gnarled faces she saw in tree bark. As a wife and mother, she'd subdued that wildness into occasional weekend hikes. Now, with Thomas gone and Sophia established in her own life, the mountains beckoned again. It was on one such hike that she first found the oak. A sudden summer storm had forced her to seek shelter, and she ducked beneath the tree's sprawling branches. What she discovered was a hollow that seemed too perfect, too inviting to be natural. The interior was dry despite the downpour, and as she sat within its wooden embrace, listening to rain drum against ancient bark, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt at home. On the 5th day of returning to the tree, she encountered Agnes Runningwater, a 78-year-old Cherokee woman who lived in a small cabin a mile down the mountain. "I've been waiting for you," Agnes had said matter-of-factly, as if they had an appointment. "The tree chooses who it wants," Agnes explained, her weathered hands gesturing toward the ancient oak. "My grandmother's grandmother knew this tree. It has always been a threshold place where healing happens." That night, in her too empty Victorian, Grace made a decision that would change everything. She placed her teaching resignation letter on blue stationery, sorted through her possessions, and prepared to leave behind the life others expected her to live. "Where are you watching from today?" Let me know in the comments below, and if this story touches your heart, be sure to subscribe. The first winter nearly broke her. Grace had created a temporary shelter within the tree's natural hollow, hanging tarps to keep out the mountain wind. It was primitive but sufficient, until the November storm hit. Wind tore through the mountain forest with malevolent determination, finding every weakness in her makeshift home. Rain poured through gaps she hadn't noticed, soaking her supplies and chilling her to the bone. By midnight, Grace huddled in the driest corner she could find. Maple pressed against her for warmth, both of them trembling. "What am I doing?" she whispered into the dog's damp fur. This was madness. As if in answer, a fragment of memory surfaced. Thomas in their garage workshop, patiently teaching her how to join two pieces of wood. "The trick," he had said, "isn't forcing the materials to do what you want. It's understanding what they're already inclined to do, then working with that natural tendency." At dawn, soaked and exhausted, Grace surveyed the damage. Half her supplies were ruined. Her shelter was in tatters, but the tree itself stood unmoved, its ancient heartwood solid and enduring. In that moment, Grace made her choice, not to retreat to civilization as everyone expected, but to build something real and permanent. That afternoon, Agnes appeared at the Oak's entrance, carrying a basket of food and a knowing expression. "You're staying," she observed, settling herself on a flat rock to watch Grace sort through her salvage supplies. "Yes," Grace confirmed, "but I need to build something better than this." Agnes nodded slowly. "The tree doesn't mind being shaped, but it wants respect. Each time you drive a nail or place a screw, ask permission first." Grace might have laughed at such advice once, but her night of vulnerability had humbled her. "How do I ask permission from a tree?" "The same way you'd ask permission from anyone, with sincerity and an open heart." When Grace began work on the door frame, her first permanent addition, something inexplicable happened. As she pressed her palm against the ancient wood, whispering, "May I?" before drilling the first pilot hole, she felt a subtle shift beneath her fingers, as if the tree was adjusting to accommodate her intention. The frame took shape over 4 days. Grace abandoned her original rigid design, instead allowing the natural curves of the wood to guide her measurements. On the 5th day, she hung the door, a solid piece of oak she'd found fallen near the creek, weathered but sound. That night, Grace slept deeply for the first time since Thomas left, not in spite of her isolation, but because of it. She had finally found a place where she could be herself without apology or explanation. 2 years passed, winter yielding to spring, summer to autumn, and back to winter again. With each season, Grace transformed the hollow oak from mere shelter into something extraordinary. She had discovered that the tree's interior was far more complex than first appeared. The heartwood had created chambers and passages through centuries of natural decay, forming spaces that seemed designed for habitation. The main chamber, what Grace came to call the heart room, was nearly 15 feet across, its ceiling arching 12 feet overhead. It was the light that obsessed her. During her second month in the tree, Grace noticed how sunbeams penetrated through tiny gaps high in the trunk, creating shifting patterns across the wooden floor. That observation sparked an idea that became her most ambitious project. In the creek bed where she collected water, Grace found quartz crystals, some as small as pebbles, others as large as her fist. She discovered that when positioned in direct sunlight, these stones captured and refracted light, sending rainbows dancing across the dark interior. Over months of experimentation, she created a system of crystal catchers and polished wood reflectors that channeled daylight deep into the tree's heart. The effect was magical. Chambers that had been perpetually shadowed now glowed with soft, diffused illumination. But it was the memory wall that truly transformed the space from shelter to sanctuary. It began with Thomas's hands. One evening, restless and melancholy, Grace took up her carving tools and began working on a section of the heart room's wall. She hadn't planned the subject, but as wood curls fell away beneath her knife, she recognized what was emerging. Thomas's hands, with their distinctive pattern of calluses and the small scar across his left thumb from a workshop accident decades ago. Once started, she couldn't stop. The carving expanded outward like ripples in still water. She carved Sophia as a child, balanced on Thomas's shoulders at the county fair. She carved their kitchen table with its characteristic nick. She carved the view from their bedroom window, the oak tree in their backyard with its tire swing. Night after night she worked by lantern light, her fingers cramping, eyes burning from concentration. The carvings weren't chronological or organized by theme. They appeared in the order memory surfaced them, raw and honest. The project was brutal in its emotional demands, forcing Grace to confront the entirety of what she had lost. By the time spring returned, the memory wall covered an entire section of the heart room, a masterwork of emotion translated into wood. What Grace couldn't have articulated was that with each carving, she was extracting grief from her body and placing it outside herself where she could see it, acknowledge it, and eventually live alongside it without being consumed. The dream came on a night when purple crocuses had just begun pushing through the snow around the oak's base. In it, Grace saw people seated in a circle within the heart room, strangers with tear-stained faces finding peace in shared silence. She woke with absolute clarity about what needed to be created next. The gathering circle took shape over 6 weeks. Grace carved seats directly from the heartwood, following the natural curve of the chamber. Each was different. One featured flowing water patterns spiraling up its back, another displayed mountain ridges in miniature detail, a third showed flames dancing across its arms. Together they formed a perfect semicircle that could seat 8 people comfortably. When completed, the gathering circle seemed to have always been there, as natural to the tree as its bark or roots. Grace sat in one of the seats, the one carved with water patterns, and understood what she had built. Not furniture, but vessels for pain, safe harbors where people could sit with their grief without being judged or hurried through it. Have you ever felt called to create something without fully understanding why? Share your experience in the comments below. David Reynolds stumbled onto her trail on a gray Tuesday in April. Grace found him sitting on a fallen log, head in his hands, clothes too expensive for hiking, but rumpled from what appeared to be days of wear. He looked up at her approach, eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I'm lost," he said simply. The tone of his voice, flat, controlled, empty, triggered recognition in Grace. She had heard that particular quality of exhaustion before, in her own voice during the darkest days after Thomas left. He followed her without question, moving with the mechanical compliance of someone too tired to resist guidance. When she opened her carved door and gestured him inside, he stepped through without comment, as if entering a tree was the most natural thing in the world. "I came up here to end it," he said finally, eyes fixed on the water surface. "Lost my company, my house, my wife left, everything gone in 6 months." Grace didn't offer reassurances or advice. She simply sat in the gathering circle across from him, present and attentive. He stayed 3 days. Grace provided food and space, but most importantly, she provided absence. Absence of judgment, absence of platitudes, absence of pressure to feel better faster. The gathering circle held David's pain without absorbing it, allowing him to examine his despair from all angles. "I don't understand what happened here," he said as he prepared to leave. "I came up this mountain to die, and now I'm going back down to try again, I guess." "The tree has that effect on people," Grace replied. David shook his head. "It's not just the tree. You didn't try to fix me. You just let me be broken for a while. Brokenness isn't something to be fixed, Grace said. It's something to be witnessed. After he left, Agnes appeared and examined the seat where David had sat in the gathering circle. It's beginning, she said. This tree has always been a threshold place, where people come when they're caught between worlds, between despair and hope, between what was and what might be. I didn't do anything for him, Grace protested. You weren't supposed to do. You were supposed to be. Agnes smiled. The Cherokee have a word for people like you. It translates roughly as space holder, one who creates and maintains sacred space where truth can be faced. The next morning, Emma Chen arrived with disturbing news. The young librarian had become Grace's most regular visitor. At 28, with a master's degree from Berkeley and purple-tipped black hair, Emma was as much an outsider in Cedar Grove as Grace had become. They're going to develop the mountain, Emma announced without preamble, dropping her backpack on Grace's wooden floor. Ridge Mountain Development bought the land rights. The town council approved it last night. Within days, survey stakes appeared on the trails, orange plastic markers with numbers and coordinates. The town council meeting was her first public appearance in Cedar Grove in nearly 2 years. Mayor Richard Campbell faltered mid-sentence when he spotted her, then recovered with practiced smoothness. As I was saying, this development represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity for Cedar Grove. My name is Grace Harrison, she began, her teacher's voice carrying clearly through the room. I live on the mountain you're planning to develop. Mr. Harrison, Mayor Campbell interrupted, while we appreciate your unique perspective, the land in question belongs to the county, not private citizens living there without permission. The land belongs to itself, Grace replied evenly, and to the Cherokee people who were its first caretakers. Emma's discovery a week later confirmed her worst fears. They've applied for controlled burn permits, the librarian explained, spreading documents across Grace's small table. Supposedly for forest management. But look at the zones they want to burn. The marked areas encompass the entire highland section where Grace's tree stood. Agnes confirmed their suspicions the next day. The burn was scheduled for August 10th, less than 2 months away. What do we do? Grace asked. The sanctuary she'd built over 2 years suddenly threatened with destruction. We prepare, Agnes answered simply, and we trust the tree. The day of the fire dawned with smoke already darkening the eastern sky. Grace stood in her doorway, watching dawn struggle to penetrate the haze. The distant crackle of flames carried on the wind. The fire had started exactly as planned, but something was wrong with its behavior. It moved too quickly, burned too hot, jumped gaps that should have contained it. For 2 weeks, Grace had prepared as best she could. She cleared brush in concentric circles around the oak, created bare earth zones that might slow approaching flames. She'd stored water in every container she could find. Agnes had brought firestones, river rocks marked with Cherokee symbols that the elder claimed would help the fire remember to spare what should be spared. Now watching the smoke thicken, Grace faced her final decision. Stay with her tree and trust it would survive, or descend the mountain to warn the town that might be endangered if the wind shifted. The answer came within the hour. Grace felt it before she saw it, a change in the air pressure against her skin. The wind was turning, pushing the fire not away from Cedar Grove as planned, but directly toward it. Maple, she called, and the old dog appeared at her side, sensing the urgency in her voice. We have to go. Grace grabbed the brass bell Thomas had given her years ago and ran, Maple keeping pace despite his aging joints. The mining bell tower stood 20 minutes down the trail at full speed, an old structure from Cedar Grove's brief period as a copper mining outpost. Emma had told her about it 2 weeks earlier. If anything goes wrong, that bell can be heard throughout the valley. Grace reached the tower gasping for breath. At the top, she grabbed the thick rope attached to the bell's clapper and pulled. The sound was enormous, a deep, resonant voice that rolled down the mountain into the valley below. She established the rhythm Emma had taught her. 3 strikes, pause, 3 strikes, pause. The old emergency pattern that meant imminent danger. Down in Cedar Grove, people emerged from homes and businesses, confused and alarmed. They gathered in streets and parking lots, looking toward the mountain, and saw what Grace had seen. Smoke, thick and black, rolling toward the valley on changed winds. On the mountain, Grace rang until her arms burned. The fire had crested the ridge above her. She could see flames through the trees, perhaps 15 minutes away from her position. She struck the bell 5 more times, then descended the ladder. As her feet touched the ground, she saw movement on the trail below, people climbing toward her. Not 1 or 2, but dozens. They'd realized their only escape route was up, not out. Grace turned and ran back up the mountain, Maple at her heels. Behind her, the townspeople followed, including those who had mocked her for 2 years, now desperate for the sanctuary they dismissed as madness. She reached the oak 3 minutes ahead of the first arrivals, 3 minutes to prepare for the impossible. She threw open the door and calculated rapidly. The heart room could hold 20 people if they crowded together, perhaps 30 if they stood packed like commuters on a subway. Inside quickly! Grace directed traffic like a battlefield medic, counting heads, calculating space, helping the weakest find places to sit in the gathering circle. 30 people, 34, 37. Harriet Blackwell staggered through the door, face streaked with soot, designer blouse torn at the shoulder. Mayor Campbell followed, his authoritative presence diminished by terror. Grace grabbed buckets of water from her reserves. Wet cloths! Everyone, cover your nose and mouth! The fire hit like a physical force. Through the few gaps they'd left unsealed, Grace could see flames engulfing the surrounding forest. The roar was deafening, heat pressing against the door and walls, testing the oak's legendary fire resistance. Someone screamed, others prayed. A child sobbed against her mother's shoulder. Grace moved through the packed chamber, offering water from the basin, checking that everyone had wet cloth to breathe through. The water flowed endlessly, defying logic, filling cup after cup until all had drunk. We're going to die here, Mayor Campbell gasped, voicing what many thought. The Heartwood will resist fire, Grace replied with more confidence than she felt. We're safer here than anywhere else on the mountain. Hours passed in suffocating fear. By mid-afternoon, the fire outside reached its peak intensity. The ancient oak groaned and creaked, wood stressed beyond what seemed bearable. Grace found herself beside Emma in the chaos. The young librarian's fingers gripped hers with desperate strength. I'm sorry, Emma whispered. I should have found a way to stop this. You tried, Grace assured her. You warned me. You rang the bell. You did everything possible. We're not going to make it, are we? We're not going to die here, Grace said with conviction she didn't feel. But that's what the moment demanded. Someone had to believe they would survive. As if in response, the groaning stopped. And then, impossibly, Grace felt something cool touch her face. She looked up toward the gaps high in the tree's crown and saw it. Water seeping down from above, running along the interior walls like tears. The tree was weeping, or the underground spring it tapped had found new paths to the surface, or something beyond rational explanation was happening. Water ran down the ancient wood, cooling it, protecting it, giving them what they needed to survive. People noticed, pressing against the walls, feeling the moisture, beginning to hope. The fire raged outside, but inside the hollow oak, water flowed and life persisted. Grace's sanctuary, tested beyond its design, was holding. Have you ever experienced a moment when hope appeared just when you thought all was lost? Share your story in the comments below. The fire exhausted itself by evening, having consumed everything flammable within reach. When Grace finally opened the door, 37 soot-covered, exhausted, but living people emerged into the twilight. The forest around them was gone, reduced to blackened stumps and smoking earth. But the ancient oak stood, scarred and damaged, yet fundamentally intact. Its bark was charred in places, branches burned away, but the heartwood had held firm. 3 days after the fire, investigators confirmed what Emma and Grace had known. The burn had been deliberately accelerated beyond any legal parameters. Ridge Mountain Development's corruption unraveled quickly as evidence emerged. Mayor Campbell, facing criminal charges, resigned in disgrace. The Highland Forest, what remained of it, was placed under permanent protection through an emergency order, citing its cultural significance to the Cherokee people and its ecological importance to the watershed. 1 week after the fire, the townspeople gathered at the base of the mountain to thank the woman they'd called crazy for 2 years. Harriet Blackwell stood at the front of the group, eyes downcast. "We were wrong about you," she said simply. "All of us. We thought you'd lost your mind, but you were building exactly what we needed when we needed it most." Grace listened from the doorway of her scarred but standing tree. She could have spoken of vindication, of judgment repaid. But that wasn't what healing required. "You climbed the mountain when you had to," she said instead. "That's what matters." In the months that followed, Grace's tree became something new, not just her private sanctuary, but a place of healing for the entire community and beyond. People came from neighboring towns, then from across the state, seeking the woman who lived in the oak and offered space for truth-telling. The community ledger, a leather-bound book Emma had brought, filled with names and messages. People signed after their visits, leaving notes of gratitude or simply marking that they'd been there, had been held by the tree's strange grace. 1 year after the fire, new growth had begun reclaiming the burned slopes. Green shoots pushed through blackened soil, seedlings reached toward sunlight. Nature was rebuilding, as nature always does when given space and time. Grace stood in her doorway, watching this rebirth with Maple beside her. The old dog moved more slowly now, gray muzzle touched with white, but his eyes remained bright and alert. They had survived the unimaginable together, and in surviving had found purpose neither could have anticipated. The tree around her had survived fire, as Agnes had promised. It had protected those who protected it, and it would stand for centuries more, offering shelter to anyone wise enough or desperate enough to seek it out. Sometimes the people who laugh at you the loudest are the ones who need you the most. And sometimes a woman has to walk away from everything just to find out who she really is. Grace Harrison had done both, and in doing so had created something extraordinary. The door to her sanctuary remained open for anyone who needed what she'd found in this ancient, hollow oak. Because beauty was meant to be shared, because grief transformed could become healing, not just for oneself, but for an entire community. What's your wisdom tree? That special place or person who helps you find healing when you need it most? Share in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.